That's Inside 8:30, Thursday.
Hello and welcome to Dateline. I'm Jana Wendt. Tonight, how the Australian government colluded with Jakarta in handing back the province of Irian Jaya to Indonesia. As the East Timorese prepare to vote for independence, we show how 30 years ago a similar story was played out in Irian Jaya, then Dutch New Guinea. Documents just released reveal how Australia actively stifled the independence movement in the former Dutch colony, while the United Nations stood and watched.
10,000 miles away in New York, the UN was drawing up plans that would seal Indonesia's control of Dutch New Guinea.
That's Fernando Ortiz Sanz from Bolivia, who was the Secretary General of the UN's representative in West Irian and was in charge of the Act of Free Choice. And he once told me off the record that West Irian was like a cancerous growth on the side of the United Nations, and his job was to surgically remove it.
Also, we'll be speaking to Russian reform politician Boris Nemtsov on his new political coalition announced only yesterday, and a look at Siberia's economic prisoners. But first, as the people of East Timor prepare to vote on their future, fellow Indonesians in the province of Irian Jaya are about to commemorate the 30th anniversary of their plebiscite on self-determination. Irian Jaya's so-called Act of Free Choice was meant to have given the people there the right to choose between integration with Indonesia or independence. But much like East Timor, the Irian Jaya experience in 1969 was clouded by violence and intimidation as an impotent United Nations watched on. The outcome of the Act of Free Choice, as it turned out, was anything but free. Of 800,000 people, only 1,025 were permitted to vote. And as we'll show tonight, Irian Jaya's often desperate calls for help were suppressed by none other than the government of Australia in collusion with Jakarta. Freelance filmmaker Mark Worth grew up in Papua New Guinea as neighbouring Irian Jaya was delivered into the hands of Indonesia. Here's his report.
Jayapura, the capital of Irian Jaya. For 30 years, this former Dutch colony has been ruled by Indonesia. The story of how Jakarta took control here is one of grand-scale deception and fraud. And as we'll show, it all happened with the consent and the assistance of Australia. Our story begins in 1960. Jayapura was then known as Hollandia, the capital of Dutch New Guinea. Holland had promised the colony independence and had trained mobile police squads to resist a threatened invasion from Indonesia.
The period that I arrived in Jayapura was under the localization period of many areas of the administration called Papuanization in West Papua at that time. And that is really the political momentum, political change, very rapid change, where students, educated elite, trade union start talking about and preparing themselves to form political parties towards the greater autonomy and preparing West Papua towards independence.
This period of rapid political change was witnessed by a young Dutch policeman, Arie van Klinken.
We did not know much of what was going on the higher level. The information was not enough. But there was a form of resentment for many people that had come from Indonesia and hoped to build up a new future in Irian Jaya.
Ari's old photos and home movies capture the hope from the dying days of Dutch colonial rule to the tense military alert.
Papua towards independence.
Wim Zongono, then a young politician in Hollandia, was looking forward to leading his people to freedom.
About this flag, that's our own design. That's our own image. All the colors, stripes, and in different colors, all explains our position. It's our symbol of the inner feeling, the fundamental identity of our people.
But the flag of a fully independent West Papua would never fly. In January 1962, Indonesia launched Operation Mandala, seizing Dutch New Guinea as its own. Its troops were led by a young General Suharto.
So they were using heavy artillery, barging the place where we were, and then you could see the heavy mortars reaching the hill, the steep ravines, pulling the rocks down, trees down. So we fled.
Outside Sorong, the locals found a dozen or so of these Indonesian infiltrants. Disappointed, malaria, sick people, tired, disappointed, yes.
Ari van Klinken was the police chief at the time, based in the western town of Sorong.
They bashed them up in their anger, and they took them to their village, where there was a local pastor, a very influential man, and he was angry for he could see that they had bashed him up. And I remember he said, and don't you know what Jesus said, how you have to treat your enemies? You have to give them food, you have to give them drink. And go and get food and drink, but don't let them escape. Well, they didn't. They had no intention of letting them escape.
10,000 miles away in New York, the UN was drawing up plans that would seal Indonesia's control of Dutch New Guinea. The so-called New York Agreement determined that the United Nations would send in a peacekeeping force called the United Nations Temporary Executive Authority, or UNTIA. UNTIA agreed to hold a plebiscite in West Papua, as it was then known, to see whether Papuans wanted to remain with Indonesia or not.
I myself, I was a bit suspicious when people said, we don't want you to go, we want the Dutch to stay, and we don't want the Indonesians to come. I thought, well, they say that to make me happy, to make me feel good. But I was wrong. And that has shown very clearly afterwards what happened in that country.
One by one, Dutch residents fled the colony as Indonesian soldiers took over.
But many people who were born in the old Dutch Empire and lived there all their life, well, you can understand that they were disappointed.
And then before the UN, UNTIA officials got into their position in Jayapura, the Indonesian military is all over the place already. Now they go visit, search from house to house, intimidated people. They walk in, take away radio, fridge, anything that they like to pick. They walk in with their arm, full arms. It's just like the victors of a war, and they like to do anything they want to do.
The United Nations was only in West Papua from October 1962 until May 1963. When they left, a blanket of darkness fell over the country.
In May 1963, West Irian returned to the folds of the motherland.
I became an Indonesian politician when I was 24, representing West Papua in the Indonesian National Parliament. At that time, anyone who was involved in politics during the Dutch administration, our movement were always followed by secret police.
In 1968, President Suharto began planning the plebiscite in West Papua known as the Act of Free Choice. This move was part of the need to legitimise the annexation of the country in the eyes of the international community. It left Australia in an awkward political position. Which of the two neighbours should it support?
Australia is a good friend of Indonesia, and don't forget that Australia is a neighbor of West Irian. If West Irian stands up and says, well, I want to have my own independence, then for Australia it's very difficult. How can Australia do for Indonesia, and how can Australia do for West Irian?
Well, what would you like to see Australia do?
Well, I hope that Australia can help West Irian from now, tomorrow, and forever.
I've got millions of things from all my journalism and all the stuff that interested me and all the old things, and somewhere in here is the old West Irian stuff.
One man who followed Australia's dilemma is author and retired reporter Hugh Lunn.
With pictures and stuff. There's the New York agreement concerning West Papua, West Irian. That was the agreement they made in 1962 to have an act of free choice 7 years later. And that sets out the whole thing. And it says somewhere in here, I underlined this back in '69, the UN and Indonesia will guarantee fully the rights, including the right of free speech, freedom of movement. They will honour these commitments, a right of self-determination. None of this happened, of course. So, you know, it all ended up being bullshit, really.
Hugh Lunn is the last surviving journalist who fully covered the Act of Free Choice.
Yeah, well, this is the start of a story I wrote in Irian Jaya back in 30 years ago, in 1969. I called the story When Justice is Undone. Pardon. And this is how it starts. The story of how America and Australia looked the other way while 800,000 people and their territory the size of France was taken over by a friendly power, and of how the United Nations averted its eyes in the same direction. It happened in Asia. It took just 3 weeks from July 14 to August 2. It even received UN approval. But to the public, it was more or less a secret.
And a secret it was until now. Documents recently released under the 30-year rule show that Australia, like other Western nations involved, knew the Act of Free Choice was a farce, yet Australia voted for the Act at the UN. This confidential Australian intelligence document quotes Fernando Horta Sanz, the UN representative in West Papua, and exposes controversial criticism of the Act of Free Choice. But at the time, nothing was done about it. In 1969, Mr. Fernando Horta Sanz said,
West Papua had to carry out in months what experts said should have taken 5 years. Papuans had inadequate information about the Act. The UN's recommendation for one man, one vote was not accepted by Indonesia. Rights of free speech and freedom of movement were not fully implemented amid tight political control by Indonesia.
So these are the pictures.
As Hulan remembers, the United Nations wanted to get West Papua off its books at any cost.
And that's the man responsible, actually. Everyone should remember him. That's Fernando Ortiz Sanz from Bolivia, who was the Secretary General of the UN's representative in West Irian and was in charge of the Act of Free Choice. And he once told me off the record that West Irian was like a cancerous growth on the side of the United Nations, and his job was to surgically remove it. Well, when I went to cover this Act of Free Choice, I read about what everyone had agreed to in 1963 to stop the war between the Dutch and the Indonesians, and that was there would be an Act of Free Choice. So I expected there to be one man, one vote. And the Indonesian system is always different from everyone else's system, and their system is, they said they were going to do it under, even though the United Nations was there and had been there for a year beforehand, they were doing it under Musyawarah, which is like what they call consensus. And so I suddenly realised there wasn't going to be one man, one vote. And so they were going to select certain people. And so I flew to the island of Biak to see one of these selections, and the United Nations was there, 4 United Nations officials, including the head, Dr. Ortiz Sanz. And to my surprise, when I arrived, there would have been about 800 Papuan villages there, and they were all very unhappy about this. They couldn't do anything because the Indonesian military was running the place, but you could see by the way they were all standing there that they were letting the UN and any reporters know what it was like. And they were all standing there, and the Indonesians said, now we're going to send our people into the crowd to find out who they want to represent them. So they sent off these Indonesian army people dressed in, as the Papuans said, as free men. In other words, they were army people dressed as civilians, and they went into the crowd. You could always tell them because they all had sunglasses and pointy-toe shoes and Seiko watches. Invariably. It's like a uniform. And they went into the crowd and came out and said, these are the 6 men who these people want to represent them. And everyone was standing there like this, and they brought the 6 out and they all stood there like this. And then suddenly out of the bushes came 3 West Irian Papuans carrying a sign. And it was 3 signs, and it should have said one man, one vote, but their English wasn't that good, so it said one vote. And they came over and stuck these things in the ground, and the Indonesians immediately wanted to pull them out of the ground. The crowd gathered around, and anyway, these 3 blokes, for daring to carry a sign saying one vote, were marched off at gunpoint. And I said to the UN people, you got to do something, they're marching them off at gunpoint. And they said, oh no, that's not our job.
Even worse was Australia's cover-up over political activist Wim Zonganau and his colleague Clements Runaway. They were so appalled by Indonesia's brutal annexation of their land, they resigned from Parliament and fled into the jungle.
So I tendered my resignation in 1969. I wrote to Nasution. As you understood, this is the way I put that letter, as you understood the struggle of your people in 1945, it's my desire to continue West Papua national struggle. So on this basis, I tender my resignation and to pursue here or abroad the West Papuan independence.
While they were hiding in the jungle, it was decided by the Free West Papua movement, the OPM, that the two would travel to New York and argue their case for West Papua. In documents just released from Australia's then Department of External Affairs, a 280-page file was uncovered on Wim Zonganau and Clement's runaway. These documents clearly outline Indonesia's fear of the pair reaching New York. Wim and Clem crossed the border into Papua New Guinea on the 31st of May 1969. PNG was still in Australian territory, and the Australians didn't want the pair to go to New York either.
Our itinerary is to reach United Nations, so we won't get out of Papua New Guinea. But somehow, it didn't happen. So they put in jail, because we refused to sign the document. They put us in jail, and then later they flew us to Manus Island.
They were detained in the refugee camp on this remote island, an Australian Navy base, but that was not enough to hold them. Even in conservative colonial Papua New Guinea, concerned expatriates sponsored their tickets to New York.
But the ticket arrived. We decided to leave Manus. We were about to board the aeroplane. We saw the district commissioner's car rushing to the tarmac, right through where the aeroplane was parked. And then we were already unstepped, about to go inside. They said, Wim and Clemens, if you board this plane, we will arrest you. You better freely come down or we arrest you. And then we insisted that we are leaving the Papua New Guinea. We are going to UN. And then they said, no, you go down or we arrest you. So we decided to step down. But there had never been any kind of explanation why they stopped us.
Little did Wim know that he was a victim of a secret Australian relationship with the Indonesian government. Just how worried the Indonesians were is highlighted in this telex from Australia's then ambassador to Indonesia, Gordon Jockel. He was determined to keep Indonesia's Foreign Minister Adam Malik happy.
Malik said he hoped we could keep the two refugees in Manus Island over the next weeks as a satisfactory way of dealing with the problem.
And this document from the Department of External Affairs.
Secret. Information from Manus. Zonganau has plane ticket. Stop. DC to inform of arrest. Stop. If they attempt to board plane, they are to be warned. Stop. They will be arrested.
And then Jockel again.
Immediate concern of Indonesia is that early arrival of these two West Irianese at the UN could stimulate defiance and seriously upset the management of conduct of the Act of Free Choice within West Irian.
But it was in Manukawari that Hugh Lum was most moved by the bravery of West Papuans in the face of increasing intimidation.
And this elderly lady came up and lifted up her skirt and pulled this out and gave it to me in front of everyone, because she obviously didn't care. And it was the names on this long petition of all the people who are against it. But she was brave enough to pull this out and give it to me. And then some people must have taken strength from this, because they started yelling out Sendiri, Sendiri, which means self or alone, alone. And this is what happened to them. They're the Indonesian soldiers dressed as civilians after they've belted them up, chucking them in the backs of trucks to take them away. And there's that big bloke punching this fellow, and he's hitting him with a truncheon, and these are Indonesians, as you can see. The policeman who was there pulled his gun out. So I ran back into the hall and went up to Order Sans and said outside, throwing people into trucks, there's a policeman with a gun. And he looked up at me and said, my job is to see what happens inside the hall, not outside. So that's how he saw his job.
As Papuans were pressured into siding with Indonesia, the independence movement gathered strength. All over West Papua, people were desperate to tell the world what was happening.
And I was just opening these, I didn't even know I had them. And there's the paper still soaked in blood that was inside the letter to show that people had been killed.
But when journalist Hugh Lunn reported on fear and discontent, it prompted an unpleasant response from Ambassador Jockle.
Gordon Jockle turned up, and either we were called around or went around to his hotel room, and he was there with the Dutch ambassador in a hotel room in Milwaukee, and he sort of said as a joke, "Oh, you blacks, you know, you're causing all this problem. I mean, where are all these letters soaked in blood? Where are all these people coming up to us? You know, we've been here all day." And I was only in my 20s, and Otto Kalk, who was about 50 and had written 10 books, said, yeah, well, you two, no one's going to talk to you people. You fly over in an air-conditioned jet plane with the Indonesian Foreign Minister, Adam Malik, and you get driven in an air-conditioned car to this air-conditioned hotel room, and you probably don't know, but you've got Indonesian secret police in rooms on either side of you. And so how's anybody going to give you a letter soaked in blood?
From regency to regency, the plebiscite went ahead, and everywhere Hugh Lunn was confronted by anxious West Papuans who couldn't believe what was happening to them.
They accidentally put me in a room on a ship with a Papuan before they quickly rushed down and got him out of there. And he said, you know, we're not going to be taken over, are we? And I said, look, I'm sorry to tell you, it's all organised. You're going to become part of Indonesia. That's what America wants, it's what Australia wants, it's what Indonesia wants. And that's what the UN is doing. That's what they're here to do. And he broke down and cried to my surprise and cried on my shoulder.
On the basis of the 1962 New York Agreement, the Act of Free Choice on whether or not the West Irianese wanted to remain within the Republic of Indonesia was held in July 1969. The people of West Irian unanimously declared their wish to remain part of Indonesia. The new order government set out to work immediately.
And of course, Indonesia was West Irian was a closed shop for the 6 years before the Act of Free Choice. And I knew that once I went, no one was going to get in there again, and that the Indonesian military was going to rule the western part of New Guinea forevermore, and it was going to be a closed shop again. So I think that's why it was a much more moving thing than Vietnam, because I was sort of leaving them behind.
So was Australia.
Yeah, well, so was everyone.
General feeling in Australia at that time, I'm talking in the early 60s and late 60s, that West Papuans were these Stone Age people, know nothing about politics, and then compelled by the Indonesian takeover, and tried to come to Papua New Guinea to grab the opportunity. But we were not.
It was typical. One Indonesian I spoke in a bus, and we had good old talk, and he said, oh yes, this is a good country here in Jaya. The only problem is there shouldn't be these Papuans.
In Jayapura today, a statue glorifies what Indonesia calls the liberation of West Papua, a celebration of freedom over colonial oppression. Wim Zonganau sees that as nothing but an inspiration to keep fighting. Every chance he gets, he pushes the message Australia stopped him from taking to the UN 30 years ago.
To continue to struggle, and we are continuing. Nelson Mandela was regarded as a terrorist, and they thought that the white minority felt that it isn't there, it's an impossible thing to get black people come to establish the majority rule in Africa. The white minority in South Africa thought it was impossible. But Mandela did show the sense of high moral dignity and a partnership with anybody in a modern, in a peaceful South Africa. And he's a good man now.
One day in Berry, I ended up in a lifeboat with just Papuans on it because we were in a ship out to sea and I was being transported, and they all couldn't accept they were going to be part of Indonesia. And so I said to them, I think you blokes are going to need this song, We Shall Overcome. And That's me singing it. Well, Pete Seeger used to sing it. We shall overcome one day. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome one day.
When Russia's President Boris Yeltsin sacked his Prime Minister Sergei Stepashin 2 weeks ago, it looked like another act of madness. It was the fourth such sacking in 16 months, and it left the world asking why. But Russians understood his behaviour better. The country's political elite is involved in a power struggle to determine who will lead Russia after Yeltsin. And Prime Minister Stepashin was guilty of failing to derail a formidable new challenge to the Kremlin led by the very popular candidate Evgeny Primakov, another former Prime Minister. In a moment, I'll be speaking with Boris Nemtsov, a former Deputy Prime Minister and another Yeltsin favourite who fell from grace. He has just established an alliance of reformers to contest December's parliamentary elections. But first, this report on Russia's new politics.
It's summer in Moscow and a time of intense politicking ahead of December's parliamentary elections. Of the newly formed groupings and political blocs, the greatest threat to President Boris Yeltsin's power is a new alliance of two centrist parties, the Fatherland All Russia Alliance. The man who pulled it together is Moscow Mayor Yuri Luzhkov, an old enemy of Yeltsin's, who has set up the Moscow city government as an alternative power base to the Kremlin.
Наш союз базируется на одинаковой идеологии отношения к проблемам государства и к проблемам развития страны.
Mayor Luzhkov has pulling power. He's attracted a number of high-profile politicians. The most important, Evgeny Primakov, the Prime Minister Boris Yeltsin sacked in May.
Главная цель – это сделать все для того, чтобы наш блок, который олицетворяет собой или отражает собой здоровые силы России, был бы доминирующим или, во всяком случае, занимал бы достойное место в Государственной Думе.
So far, Luzhkov claims he won't run for president next year, which leaves Primakov the favourite. He's a conservative, highly respected politician who will bring in votes, including those that might otherwise go to the communists. To political analysts like Glenn Waller, the combination of Luzhkov and Primakov is a winner.
I think it's going to be very powerful. With Primakov heading the list to the Duma, they're likely to take first place. That is, they're likely to come in front of the communists, and they might even gather about 40% of the seats in the Duma. The real struggle that's going on is obviously over the presidential succession. The political system here is very much based on that one central figure, and that is a win all or lose all contest. Now, if at the end of this year an oppositionist Duma is elected, then that Duma is not able to be disbanded for its first year, which means that Yeltsin will have very few levers with which to play with the Duma. And the Duma could, really, this is what the Kremlin analysts are very worried about at the moment, as soon as the Duma comes in, if it's oppositionist, it could insist on the dismissal of the Prime Minister. And given that the Prime Minister, Putin, is Yeltsin's designated successor, they could remove him from the political scene with one swipe.
President Yeltsin and his entourage have been in power for a long time, and there's a lot to lose. There are allegations of corruption, the amassing of vast personal fortunes. Mayor Luzhkov has made no promises to protect the Yeltsin clan once out of office.
Luzhkov already has a very well-formed structure under him with people already there, and that really unsettles people around Yeltsin, because they see that if Lushkov became president, there'd be no room for them there. So if Lushkov becomes president, we'll have quite a substantial turnover in the elite, in the ruling positions.
The alliance is not the only new bloc to challenge the Kremlin. Boris Nemtsov, once the deputy prime minister and the golden boy of Yeltsin's young reformers, yesterday announced his own alliance with another former prime minister, Sergei Kirienko.
Мы считаем, что в 21 веке должны управлять страной молодые энергичные люди.
These reformers represent the younger, well-educated, pro-Western politicians, to their misfortune discredited by their role in Yeltsin's reform failures.
Any bloc or party which contests election and says that they are supporting the Kremlin or Boris Yeltsin will automatically lose votes. So I think they will be playing down their connections with the Kremlin, but undoubtedly this development will please the Kremlin, and in fact Prime Minister Putin last week gathered together former prime ministers and tried to stitch together just such an alliance.
The Nemtsov alliance needs a rival to Primakov's popularity to have a chance of grabbing a lot of votes. They need someone like Sergei Stepashin, the latest prime minister, to bite the dust. But the right remains divided. Nemtsov's alliance is the first successful attempt at forming a liberal right-wing group.
Mr. Nemtsov, welcome to Dateline. Can you explain simply what it is that your new alliance stands for?
Well, we are Russian liberals. We are for European style of market economy. Unfortunately, Russia has a lot of problems in monopolies, in so-called crony capitalism, which exists in the Far East, and we have to change this situation in our society. It's the first point. Second, we are for transparency of the power and equal rights for everybody. We are for increasing a role of the court system, and we have a program against corruption. That's why we are liberal in Russian point of view, and I hope that Russian citizens will vote for us.
You are regarded as reformers, but you're also blamed by many Russians for the state of the economy.
Well, there are several myths in the country. One of them is that crisis happened because of young reformers. But frankly speaking, crisis happened because of absence of reforms in the country. Soviet nomenclature and old-style authorities are in the power. Look at Kremlin, look at the White House, look at the State Duma, etc. Look at the governance faces throughout the country. And you noted that there are only few very modern politicians in the top of political society. Russia needs real reforms. Russia needs real modern politicians. Russia needs young generation, not in the power, but in business, in former Soviet-style companies. And I think that contradiction between generations is one of the problems of Russia.
You've said that it was very difficult to form this alliance. Mr. Stepashin said that it was impossible to build an alliance because the egos involved were too big. Why is it so hard for the right to get together in a meaningful way?
You know, I represent Just Cause Coalition, and all of politicians which are a member of our coalition have no any ambitions if Stepashin will be a leader. We support an idea of leadership of Mr. Stepashin, and we were ready to give him a chance to combine team he wants without any proposals from liberal Just Cause Coalition. Unfortunately, we were only one of the organizations which suggested such idea. Nevertheless, I hope that Stepashin will be a real favorite candidate for presidential race, and it seems to me that our coalition will support him in presidential race. Nevertheless, what's happened with his decision? If he will be an independent deputy, this is not bad to run for presidential election, and we are ready to support him.
I assume that Mr. Yeltsin would be pleased, even relieved, if you were to muster some strength. Have you spoken to Mr. Yeltsin about your announcement?
No. Kremlin didn't play any role in this coalition, and this is great decision. This is great achievement of our coalition. We are in the opposition of Kremlin power now. We want to reduce the power of presidential administration, and Yeltsin knows about that.
All right, so you are distancing yourself from the Kremlin then. What is your attitude to the possible prosecution of Mr. Yeltsin and his family for alleged corruption after he retires?
This is a very painful question for family. I mean Yeltsin family, big family. But I think that everybody has to be in the equal situation in a legal point of view. That's why if it will be investigation concerning corruption inside Kremlin, a Russian prosecution system had to investigate it very carefully without paying any attention to names and to positions. I don't believe that Yeltsin himself is corrupted. I don't believe in that. I know Yeltsin for 8 years, and I don't believe in that. As far as family is concerned, maybe, but the main problem is how to promote, how to proceed this investigation without resistance from officials in Kremlin.
Mr. Yeltsin has tried everything possible to stop the progress of the Fatherland All-Russia alliance. What other avenues do you think are open to him to slow them down?
Well, you know, Fatherland and All-Russia coalition is not bad for Russia, frankly. Why? Because the main role for this coalition is to fight against communism and against Communist Party. And I hope that Fatherland All-Russia coalition will occupy seats of communists in existing parliament, which is good. From the other hand, these organizations represent Russian bureaucracy and Russian nomenclature, and we are against their views concerning future economic and social development of the country. They believe only in bureaucracy, they believe only in state control on economy, and we believe only in honest and energetic and very ambitious people. As far as Yeltsin is concerned, Yeltsin is very close, in the point of view of his background, Yeltsin is very close to Lushkov and Primakov. I don't know even any differences between them. That's why if you look at the political ideas, I think that Yeltsin has to support this coalition, not our coalition, but coalition of Soviet-style bureaucrats.
But it is obvious that he is very unhappy about the potential power base of this coalition.
He is afraid, you know, it seems to me that he's afraid about the future of his family, he's afraid about his own future, and he's afraid about Lushkov. But, you know, this is not political explanation. This is very, very individual. And I think that Lushkov is ready to discuss such problems.
I know that you called Mr. Yeltsin's dismissal of Mr. Stepashin madness. Is that really what we're talking about in Mr. Yeltsin's case?
You know, I'm not a doctor, unfortunately. That's why I don't know an exact answer. Only people from Central Clinic of Russian Federation could give you an exact answer. I mean only political consequences of such decision. If every bureaucrat will understand that after 3 months he will be fired, what is his ideas, what is his proposals? The only idea for such guys is how to steal money, that's it. That's why Yeltsin did a terrible job, and that's why I describe this like using medicine terms, and that's all.
Mr. Yeltsin has nominated Mr. Putin as his preferred successor.
Excuse me for interruption. This is a joke. This is a joke. If Yeltsin suggested somebody like his successor, he will fire this guy immediately. That's why this is not for discussion. If you look at Yeltsin rating now, his rating is about 1% or 2%. And more than 90% of Russian people are against him. That's why if Yeltsin suggested somebody like his successor, this is a great sign to vote against him.
So I take it that you don't think Mr. Putin has a big future?
The position of Mr. Putin now is very, very complicated. First of all, he is not public politician, and he has to prove society that he can do this. From the other hand, everybody understands that he is a choice of Kremlin, which is disaster for every politician in Russia.
Mr. Nemtsov, I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Bye.
Boris Nemtsov. And while the political machinations continue in Moscow, thousands of kilometers away in the wastelands of Siberia, ordinary Russians battle for survival. Isolated and forgotten, these Russians came to Siberia not as prisoners, but as economic migrants enticed by generous salaries from the Soviet government. But with the collapse of the Russian economy, no one is being paid, and people have just been left to their fate. Sue Lloyd-Roberts reports on Russia's new gulags.
To mention the Kalmar River to a Russian is like speaking of Auschwitz to Westerners. Gulags once lined this frozen and infamous stretch. Stalin's labour camps where up to 20 million inmates are said to have either worked, starved or frozen to death. Where summer doesn't arrive until June, and for much of the rest of the time temperatures can fall to as low as 50 below freezing. Camp number 3 was built on a gold mine, and the few who survived the experience still live here. 72-year-old Tatiana claims she was sent to the Gulag on trumped-up political charges. She was given a 5-year sentence when she was 17. But with all the terrible memories associated with this area, why didn't she and the others leave when they were released?
А куда же я поеду? Что меня повезет куда? Во-первых, я освободилась ни пароходов, ни самолетов. Ни транспорт до Магадана уже не ходит. 10 тысяч километров проехать, это не 100 километров. Что когда была у нас 136 километров пешком гнали, и мы дошли. Как бы то ни дошли, но дошли. Полубоссы и полуразеты. А это 10 тысяч километров. Ну как бы мы проехали?
Although Stalin's network of gulags was dismantled over 40 years ago, history would appear to be repeating itself here in northeastern Siberia. While there are few of those former political prisoners still alive, there's a new generation of exiles here, made prisoners by the collapse of the Russian economy. The industrial infrastructure which had been built around the gulags survived their closure. Moscow enticed people here to work on the mines and to keep the towns going by offering wages 3 times those they could earn back in European Russia. They came in their thousands, the Soviet equivalent of the gold rush, expecting a hard frontier lifestyle and high earnings. But the industry collapsed along with the Soviet Union. The only energy generated today is from the coal-fired boilers which heat the town but leave its residents marooned in oceans of black snow. With the collapse of the ruble last year, this area and many others like it across northeastern Russia were finally cast adrift. Moscow said it could no longer send the annual shipments of food and medicine which kept these communities alive, leaving people literally stranded. There are just 2 Red Cross workers to help 500,000 people in the Kalmar area. It's taken a 9-hour drive to reach Siemchan, the first town on their list, from where they told me they'd been pleas for help for over a year now, but they'd had to wait to collect the aid. The couple sent to Mount This, the first stage of the rescue operation, know all about the shattered hopes of the big ruble hunters. Luba first arrived in the region as a government cartographer. Her husband, Valery, was a geologist for the gold mine.
В юношестве читал очень много романтических книжек, где описывалось о жизни геологов, об их романтике, ну, о запахе тайги, вкуса чая у костра. Вот и приехал сюда, чтобы все это попробовать на себе, ощутить все это. А теперь работаю в Красном Кресте, развожу гуманитарную помощь всем людям, нуждающимся здесь и страждущим.
Luba is worried. They only have 280 food boxes, and they've just been told by the town authorities that 700 families can't feed their children. She says people are going to have to share.
В России очень трудно заниматься гуманитарной помощью. В силу ряда причин государство не в состоянии помочь всем, кто нуждается. И поэтому мы приходим на помощь туда, где мы наиболее нужны. Заниматься благотворительностью очень трудно. И мы делаем это и собираем деньги, чтобы оказывать людям помощь. И нам приходится носить такие коробки.
When Luba meets her first family, she changes her mind about making them share a box. The father, Igor, tells her that one of his 3 children is already in hospital with pneumonia compounded by malnutrition. He came here as a skilled aviation mechanic with a dream of earning enough to build a house back home in the Ukraine. Now they can't afford train tickets. They haven't even seen rice, flour or tinned meat in 3 years.
Раньше здесь семчане был ГУЛАГ политический, содержали заключенных. Вот. У меня есть книги про нашу жизнь, вернее, про жизнь политических заключенных. Вот даже сравнивая свою жизнь с жизнью политических заключенных, я прихожу к выводу, что политических заключенных по тем нормативам, которым пишут, кормили лучше, чем сейчас мы питаемся в настоящий момент. Обращался в разные инстанции, вот, к главе районной администрации, к главе Магаданской области. Ну, они возвращают все эти бумаги мои, с которыми я обращался. Опять в Среднекамский наш район, главе администрации. И бюрократия эта партийная вся бывшая, сейчас уже, наверное, демократы они себя называют, фактически ничего для людей не делают.
The next stop is the hospital, where Luba apologizes to doctors because she hasn't any medicine for them. The food parcel is just a token for the hospital, which has long since run out of drugs. There are no medicines to treat the children who have pneumonia or TB. The rate here is among the highest in Russia. The doctors only keep them here to ensure that they get fed and keep warm.
В течение года и более сотрудники нашей больницы не получают заработную плату, но все мы как-то стараемся выжить, потому что мы медицинские работники, другого пути у нас нет. Мы очень любим людей, и наша профессия заставляет нас, вот, и мы не можем уехать отсюда. Не можем уехать. Мы очень любим людей.
Stalin built his gulag so far away and made them so awful to deter his people from criminal activity and political opposition. Unable to escape, the present inmates of this gulag archipelago must be wondering what they did wrong.
Sue Lloyd-Roberts reporting from Siberia. And that's the programme for tonight. Next week, Dateline travels to Northern Ireland, where, after an initial wave of optimism, the peace process appears to be unravelling. Join us when reporter Graham Davis meets the hard men of the IRA. Until then, good night.
And our birthdays are on the same day. His ears are lovely. And his tail's funny. We were both in training together. I look after him and he looks after me. He always listens to me. The man where we got him from told me that exercise and feeding were good for him. I'll always remember what he told me.
If you want the best for your dog, Pedigree Pal provides all the real meat nourishment they'll ever need.
He's my friend. I